Some buildings aren't just made of stone and mortar. They're built on secrets, on the weight of the unconfessed. Welcome to St. Augustine's, a forgotten church swallowed by the Louisiana Bayou. A place where the air is thick with more than just humidity. My name is Elias Thorne, and I came here to escape my past. Instead, I found myself living by 3 strange rules just to survive the present. What's the eeriest sound you've ever heard in an old building? Share your experience in the comments below. And if you dare to step across this threshold with me, subscribe to Night Creepypasta Rules and ring that bell. Because in St. Augustine's, the silence isn't empty, it's listening. Let the service begin. The third hymnal smoldered to ash in the cavernous cold stone fireplace of St. Augustine's sacristy. Its pungent, acrid scent, a sacrilegious perfume mingling with the eternal dampness of the Louisiana Bayou. Elias Thorne, diffuser of histories, weaver of sights. The accusations, penned in a rust-dark ink upon a page that had mysteriously opened to bear my name, were a judgment rendered. This was only my second night in this forgotten, moss-draped Gothic relic, a place where even the shadows seemed to hold their breath. Already, the church knew me, or perhaps it had been expecting me. My name, or what's left of it in any reputable archival circle, is Elias Thorne. I was a historian, a conservator of fragile paper and faded ink, until the Ashworth collection, a moment's misjudgment, a breath of air too humid, a chemical agent too potent. The details hardly mattered anymore. What mattered was the ruin, the irretrievable loss, and the whispers that followed me like hungry dogs. So I ran to the furthest, most obscure posting I could find. Temporary caretaker and restorer for the lost church of St. Augustine, offered by a cryptic entity calling itself the St. Augustine Heritage Preservation Society. My sole contact, a Miss Evangeline Dubois, communicated only through crackling, infrequent phone calls and stiff, yellowed letters bearing no return address, just a New Orleans postmark as old as the ink she used. The keys had arrived by courier, along with a single sheet of brittle paper outlining 3 directives, not rules. She'd insisted in her low, resonant voice over the phone, a voice that sounded like cobwebs and old velvet. Doctrines for the well-being of the consecrated space and the temporal steward. That was me, the temporal steward. And judging by the hymnals, my stewardship was already on trial. The church itself was a magnificent, decaying beast, slowly being reclaimed by the bayou. Spanish moss hung from the skeletal branches of ancient oaks like funeral shrouds, their roots tangling with the crumbling foundations. The air was thick with the scent of swamp mud, decaying cypress, and a cloying sweetness I couldn't quite identify. Magnolia perhaps gone wrong, or some funereal bloom unique to this forgotten corner of the world. On my first brief, unnerving foray into the surrounding hamlet, a collection of weathered shotgun shacks and boarded-up storefronts almost swallowed by the encroaching swamp, I'd encountered Father Michael Moreau. Or rather, had found me. He'd emerged from the shadows of a leaning live oak, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his soutane stained and torn. He'd grabbed my arm, his fingers like "Gate, the bells," he'd hissed, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey and something else, something like fear itself. Don't wake the bells. They don't call to God anymore. They call the congregation, the one that never leaves. He'd then scuttled away, a gaunt, terrified wraith swallowed by the swamp's green gloom. Now, watching the last embers of the third hymnal die, a new sound reached me. Not from the swamp, not from the wind sighing through the broken stained glass windows. It was a soft, collective sigh, impossibly close, seeming to emanate from the very plaster of the sacristy walls, from the dark, polished wood of the confessionals, from the cold flagstones beneath my feet. It was a sound of many voices, weary, mournful, yet undeniably aware. A chill, colder than the Bayou night, traced its way down my spine. I wasn't just restoring a church. I was an uninvited guest in a place still very much inhabited, and I had the distinct, chilling sensation that my every move, my every thought, my every past sin was being meticulously, silently observed. The days at St. Augustine settled into a disquieting routine of painstaking restoration work by feeble lamplight, punctuated by the unnerving phenomena of the nights. My small cot in the draughty sacristy offered little respite. Sleep was a shallow, troubled affair, filled with dreams of crumbling paper, accusing eyes, and the distant, dissonant chanting of an unseen choir. The church was a symphony of subtle horrors. The way the shadows in the nave seemed to lengthen and twist when my back was turned, the faint, inexplicable scent of beeswax and incense in long-abandoned chapels, the soft, dry rustle from within the dear, locked organ pipes, as if something delicate and papery were stirring. My only link to the outside world, Miss Evangeline Dubois, remained a frustrating enigma. Her occasional, crackling phone calls were brief. Her inquiries focused solely on the progress of the restoration, her voice never betraying any emotion or offering any real answers to my increasingly urgent, if hesitantly phrased, questions about the church's peculiarities. The Heritage Society has every confidence in your discretion and adherence to the established protocols, Mr. Thorne, was her standard, chillingly polite sign-off. The first rule: don't ring the bell tower. It summons shadows. Was tested not by intent, but by the indifferent fury of a Louisiana squall. A sudden violent thunderstorm blew in from the Gulf one afternoon, the wind shrieking like a tortured soul, rain lashing against the ancient cypress timbers of the bell tower. I was in the main sanctuary, attempting to secure a loose shutter, when a deafening crack of thunder, closer than any I'd ever heard, shook the church to its foundations. It was followed, a split second later, by a deep, resonant boom. A massive rotten branch, torn from one of the ancient oaks, had crashed against the bell tower, its weight inadvertently, momentarily, tugging the old bell rope. A single, solitary toll. But it was enough. The already dim light within the church seemed to dim further, the shadows congealing, deepening, taking on an almost tangible quality. They stretched and flowed like black, viscous liquid up the stone pillars, across the vaulted ceiling, pooling in the darkened alcoves. They weren't just absences of light. They felt like presences, cold, watchful, and utterly alien. The temperature in the sanctuary plummeted. The air grew thick, heavy, pressing in on me, making it hard to breathe. And from within those animated shadows I heard it. A sibilant, collective whisper, a chorus of dry, rustling voices, like 100-year-old confessions stirred from a long sleep. They weren't forming words, not yet. But the intent was clear. Observation, judgment, and a cold, patient hunger. It was during the uneasy calm after that storm that Lena Baptiste appeared. I found her sketching the grotesquely beautiful gargoyles near the church's Gethsemane garden, her charcoal stick flying across the page, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was young, perhaps early 20s, with an artist's keen, observant eyes and an air of fearless curiosity. She introduced herself as a local folklore student, researching the lost histories and silenced voices of the Bayou, St. Augustine's being her current obsession. "That bell," she said, her gaze flicking up to the tower. "It only ever rings for a reason, they say. Not always a good one." She told me tales whispered by the old Cajun trappers and shrimpers, stories of a shadow congregation that answered the bell's call, of a church that ate sins and kept the sinners for dessert. Her fascination was infectious, yet her presence, her grounding normalcy, was a brief, welcome respite from the church's oppressive atmosphere. She seemed intrigued by my work, by my isolation, and perhaps by the haunted look I was sure I now wore permanently. After the bell incident, the shadows in St. Augustine's were never quite the same. They seemed more alert. And late that night, as I was sweeping the chancel, my flashlight beam caught a fine black, almost greasy dust coating the pulpit, the altar, and the first few rows of pews, a dust that hadn't been there before the bell tolled. It had no discernible scent, but when a particle landed on my hand, it felt colder than ice, and left a faint oily smudge that wouldn't easily wipe away. The shadows had left their mark. The hymnals became my personal tormentors. It wasn't every night, not even every week. It was unpredictable, which somehow made it worse. I'd enter the sacristy, a cold dread coiling in my gut, and find one, sometimes two or three, lying open on the heavy oak table, their pages riffled as if by an unseen, deliberate hand, and always, always, on a page near the front, my name, Elias Thorne. Beneath it, in that same rust, dark, blood-like ink, new accusations, new sins, dredged from the forgotten corners of my memory. Elias Thorne, he who stood by while truth crumbled. Elias Thorne, his silence, a betrayal. They weren't just random condemnations. They were specific, intimate, targeting the very core of my past failures, my deepest shames. The act of burning them became a grim, necessary ritual. The antique fireplace in the sacristy, rarely used for warmth, now consumed these paper effigies of my guilt on a regular basis. The scent of burning paper, once a smell I associated with cozy libraries and academic pursuits, now reeked of judgment and a terrifying, specific knowledge. And with each burning, that faint, almost imperceptible smell of something else, something like scorched meat or hair, seemed to grow a fraction stronger, a sickening undertone to the acrid smoke. Father Moreau found me during one of these pyres of self-recrimination. He appeared at the sacristy door, no longer the wild-eyed prophet of the swamp, but a man hollowed out by a fear too profound for words. He just watched the flames for a long moment, his face etched with a terrible understanding. They're quickening their claim on you, son, he finally rasped, his voice hoarse. The lexicon of judgment. That's what my predecessor called those hymnals. He said they don't just record sin, they consume it, and in consuming it, they bind the sinner to this place. He sank onto a rickety chair, his gaze lost in the flames. When your name appears, it means the church has accepted your application for eternal membership. He gave a dry, mirthless chuckle. My name was in them for years, until I offered it something else to read. His eyes flickered with a brief, terrifying lucidity. He wouldn't elaborate. His warning about a final guardian and the harvest of ripened souls echoed in my mind, each word a fresh barb of dread. Was Miss Dubois this guardian? Was my restoration work merely a prelude to my own harvest? Lena Baptiste became an anchor in the encroaching madness. Her visits, initially driven by artistic curiosity, became more frequent, more focused. She was fascinated by the hymnals, by the strange ink, by the chillingly specific nature of the accusations against me. With her knowledge of local history and arcane symbology, a subject she pursued with an almost academic rigor, she began to help me research. This ink, Elias, she said one afternoon, hunched over a fragment I'd managed to save from the flames, examining it with a small magnifying glass. It's not just iron gall. There are organic compounds, traces of something cellular, and these marginalia. She pointed to tiny, almost invisible symbols scribbled around my name. They aren't Latin or any known ecclesiastical script. They look more like binding sigils or property markers. Her research led us to obscure historical records, to whispers of forgotten matriarchal Creole order that had once held sway over St. Augustine's, long before official Catholic consecration, an order that practiced a syncretic faith, blending European mysticism with African and Native American spiritual traditions, focusing on the transference of spiritual burdens and the purification through communal confession. Their hymnals were said to be living documents, absorbing the transgressions of their congregation. The mini-hook that solidified our darkest fears came from an unexpected source. Cleaning out the ashes from yet another burned hymnal, Elias found a small, almost completely charred piece of vellum. It was thicker, older than the other pages, and on it, in a different spider script, was not his name, but another. Evangeline D. The rest was lost to the flames. Evangeline Dubois, her name consumed by the same judgment as mine. Was she a past victim, or was this a clue to her true nature, her own ancient, binding pact with this insatiable church? The psychic weight of St. Augustine's grew heavier with each passing day. The isolation, the constant oral and olfactory reminders of unseen presences, the insidious knowledge that my deepest shames were fodder for some spectral judgment. It was all beginning to erode my carefully constructed defenses. I started to doubt my own perceptions, to question whether the whispers were real or just the echoes of my own fracturing sanity. My past failures, the Ashworth Collection disaster, replayed in my mind with an almost hallucinatory clarity, each memory a fresh, self-inflicted wound. The third rule, when the Pews creak your sins, don't pray, they're confessing you, was invoked on a night steeped in an almost preternatural stillness. The air in the main nave was cold, stagnant, heavy with the scent of dust, decay, and that ever-present, sickly, sweet, funereal enhance. I was meticulously documenting the termite damage on one of the massive oak pews near the altar, the only sounds my own breathing, and the scratch of my pencil on the notepad. Then it began, a soft creak from the pew beside me, then another from the one behind. Not the random groans of old wood settling. These were rhythmic, almost conversational. The creaks and pops deepened, becoming a chorus of low, mournful groans, interspersed with sharp, cracking sounds like arthritic knuckles. Gradually, terrifyingly, these sounds began to resolve into whispers. My whispers, not disembodied voices from the walls, but my own voice, or a grotesque, multi-layered caricature of it, seeping from the very wood of the pews. It was confessing things I'd buried deep, things I'd never spoken aloud, not even to myself, the little white lies that greased the wheels of social interaction, the moments of cowardice I'd rationalized away, the secret, selfish ambitions I'd harbored, the time I deliberately omitted a crucial piece of research for a rival colleague, the overwhelming, crushing guilt I still felt about the Ashworth Collection, a guilt that went far beyond mere professional incompetence. Each creak, each groan, each whispered confession was a fresh lash, stripping away my defenses, exposing the raw, shameful core of my being. An unbearable urge to fall to my knees, to pray, to beg for forgiveness from something, anything, welled up within me. My hands clenched, my body trembled. The ornate crucifix-laden altar seemed to beckon, promising absolution, relief. Miss Thorne's rule, cold and absolute, cut through the torment. Don't pray, they're confessing you. Lena, who had insisted on accompanying me that night, her face pale with a mixture of fear and fascinated horror, watched me with wide, concerned eyes. She couldn't hear the specific words, not my whispered confessions, but she felt it. The oppressive weight in the air, the almost visible waves of despair emanating from the pews, the way the shadows seemed to writhe and coil around me. She later told me she saw faint, ghostly figures, dozens of them, kneeling in the pews, their heads bowed, their forms indistinct, as if they were the source or the audience of this terrible, personalized litany. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to remain standing, to breathe through the onslaught. Each whispered sin was a fresh torment, but I would not kneel. I would not pray. To do so, I instinctively knew, would be to surrender, to join that unseen, penitent chorus, to become another permanent fixture in St. Augustine's vast, echoing archive of sorrow. Father Moreau, whom Lena had managed to contact in a panic, arrived as the pew confessions were finally, mercifully, beginning to subside. He looked older, more broken than ever. "The chorus of penance," he rasped, leaning heavily on his cane, his eyes darting nervously around the shadowed nave. "They draw it out of you, son. Every hidden stain. They need it. They feed on it. Praying only anchors you to their eternal service." He made a warding sign. "This church doesn't offer forgiveness. It offers an eternity to regret." Driven by a new, desperate urgency, Lena and I, with a reluctant, terrified Father Moreau guiding us from a safe distance, explored the labyrinthine crypts beneath the church. We found it in a forgotten, sealed-off ossuary, a vast, subterranean chamber, its walls lined not just with bones, but with thousands upon thousands of small, rolled-up vellum scrolls, each tied with a black ribbon. Each scroll, Father Moreau explained with a shudder, was a captured confession, a soul bound to the church through its unrepented sins. And in the center of the chamber, on a raised stone dais, was a single, massive, open ledger, its pages filled with names, dates, and detailed accounts of transgressions spanning centuries. The lexicon of ruin. The mini-hook was a fresh entry, at the very bottom of the current page, penned in that same rust-dark, blood-like ink I knew so well. It was my name, Elias Thorne. It was my name, Elias Thorne. And beside it, not a list of my sins, but a single, chilling annotation. Candidate for ascension. Solstice approaching. And just below that, in a fainter, spidier hand, almost invisible, Evangeline Dubois, custodian, awaiting quittance. The solstice, the same celestial event that had marked other disappearances, other offerings, in the church's bloody history. And Miss Dubois, awaiting quittance, release, or payment. My time, it seemed, was running out. The approaching winter solstice hung over St. Augustine's like a death knell. Each night, the atmosphere within its decaying walls grew more charged, the whispers more insistent, the shadows more predatory. The pews now groaned with a constant low litany of imagined and actual transgressions. Not just mine, but a chorus of unseen, suffering souls. The hymnals in the sacristy seemed to multiply, each new one bearing my name. Each new page a fresh, damning indictment. My restoration work felt like a macabre joke. I was preserving a tomb that was actively trying to entomb me. Lena Baptista, her artistic curiosity now fully supplanted by a fierce protective loyalty, became my shadow, a research into the church's syncretic past and its keepers of burdens becoming a desperate race against time. Father Moreau, his initial terror giving way to a grim, fatalistic resolve, armed us with what little knowledge he possessed. Tales of counter-rituals, of sacred herbs used by local traiteurs to ward off malevolent spirits, of the importance of unburdening the church before it claimed another soul. The night of the solstice arrived with an unnatural, oppressive stillness. The bayou outside was silent, the usually vibrant chorus of insects and frogs earth to nothing. The air within St. Augustine's was thick, almost viscous, heavy with the scent of swamp lilies, decaying paper, and something else, a faint coppery tang, like fresh blood. This was the night of the ascension, the night the custodian would claim their quittance. And then she appeared. Not as a disembodied voice over a crackling phone line, but in the flesh. Miss Evangeline Dubois. She didn't enter through the main doors. but materialized from the deepest shadows of the chancel, as if the church itself had birthed her. She was older than the voice suggested, yet ageless. Her skin like old parchment stretched tight over sharp bones, her eyes burning with a cold, ancient intelligence. The woman from the 19th century portrait, impossibly, terrifyingly alive. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice the same low, resonant hum I remembered, but now imbued with an undeniable power that filled the vast space. "Your stewardship has been exemplary. Exemplary. It seems, are you?" She gestured towards the altar, where the massive open ledger from the crypt now lay, its pages glowing faintly. "Your final entry awaits. Who are you?" I managed my voice hoarse, Lena and Father Moreau flanking me, their faces pale but determined. Lena clutched a pouch of pungent herbs. Father Moreau, a heavy silver-bound crucifix. A thin smile touched Miss Dubois' lips. "I am the echo of its first sin, and the vessel of its last. I am the librarian of laments, the cantor of confessions long unburdened. I am what this church is, Mr. Thorne. And tonight, with your generous contribution, I will finally be granted my quittance, my release, by making me another prisoner here." I spat, my fear warring with a surge of defiant rage. "Prisoner? Oh no, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice almost gentle. "A cornerstone, a fresh voice in the eternal chorus. Your guilt, your meticulous nature, your deep understanding of forgotten things. You are a perfect addition. You will help St. Augustine's remember, and in remembering, it grows stronger. And I, in turn, am freed from the burden of its oldest memories." She raised a hand, and the shadows around us writhed, coalescing into indistinct, vaguely human forms. The congregation of echoes, now more tangible than ever, their myriad whispers focusing into a single, hypnotic chant. Unburden, unburden. Join the chorus, join the knowing. The hymnals lining the walls flew open, their pages flipping wildly, all stopping on entries that weren't just my name, but detailed, nightmarish accounts of my deepest fears, my most private, my most private failings, as if the lexicon of judgment was now reading me aloud to the world. The pews around us began to creak and groan, not with my sins alone, but with a cacophony of 1,000 tormented confessions, threatening to drown out all thought, all resistance. "It's a transference ritual," Lena hissed, clutching her pouch of herbs tighter. "She intends to pour all the church's collected sin, its psychic weight, into you, Elias. That's how she rejuvenates, how she achieves her quittance." "The bell, Father!" I yelled, an idea desperate and wild forming in my mind. "The first rule, it summons shadows. But Theron Ironridge, your predecessor, he used the bell, didn't he? Not just to summon, but to direct, to banish?" Father Moreau's eyes widened. The dissonant peal, a forgotten counter ritual. It was said to shatter the choir, to confuse the appetite of the church, but it requires a true heart, a righteous fury. "I may not have a righteous heart, Father," I said grimly, my gaze locking with Miss Dubois' cold, ancient eyes. "But I have fury enough for 10. I turned to Lena. "The herbs, can they create a circle of protection? Can they ward the Belfry, just for a few moments?" Lena nodded, her face set. "Bayou magic is strong against old rot, Mr. Thorne. Let's give this grand dame a taste of something new." What followed was a desperate, chaotic ballet, while Father Moreau, his voice surprisingly strong, began to chant a Latin litany of protection, his crucifix held high against the encroaching shadows. Lena darted towards the bell tower stairs, scattering her pungent herbs, creating a fragrant, shimmering barrier. against the writhing darkness. Miss Dubois watched, her smile never wavering, confident in her ancient power. The congregation of echoes surged against Lena's fragile ward, their whispers turning to enraged hisses. I raced towards the bell tower rope, the weight of 1,000 sins pressing down on me, the confessions from the pews screaming in my ears. The first rule was to not ring and nammering. But what if the rule was incomplete? What if the way you rang it mattered? Reaching the thick, greasy rope, I began to pull. Not the single summoning toll, but a frantic, jarring, a rhythmic peal, a clangorous, dissonant cacophony that clashed violently with the hypnotic chant of the congregation and the groaning confessions of the pews. I tonight. 1, 2, 3, then a pause, then 2 quick, then 5 slow, a pattern from one of Theron's more obscure, heretical notations that Dr. Finch had shown me from her iron-rich research. Something about shattering the resonant vessel. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. The shadows shriek, a sound like tearing silk and breaking glass. The glowing ledger on the altar pulsed erratically, then went dark. The hymnals slammed shut. The pews fell silent. Miss Dubois' serene smile finally faltered, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief, then dawning fury. "No!" she screamed, her voice no longer a calm hum, but a raw, ancient shriek. "You defile the sanctum! You break the canon! You cannot silence the sins!" The church itself seemed to groan in protest, the very stones vibrating with a malevolent energy. The dissonant peal was working, but it was also unleashing something else, something even older, something the carefully constructed rules had been designed to keep in check. The shadows didn't just retreat. They began to coalesce around Miss Dubois, no longer her servants, but her accusers, their whispers turning into 1,000 condemnations directed at her ancient, unrepented crimes. She looked down at her hands, which were suddenly translucent, her form flickering like a dying flame. The stolen centuries, the borrowed life force, it was being reclaimed. "My quittance," she whimpered, her voice fading as the shadows, the congregation of echoes she had once commanded, began to enfold her, to drag her down into the cold, unforgiving flagstones of St. Augustine's. Her final spectral scream was absorbed into the sudden, deafening silence of the bell tower. The dissonant peal had shattered more than just the ritual. It had shattered the custodian herself. And as the last echo of her cry faded, a profound, almost unholy quiet fell upon the church of St. Augustine. The silence that followed Miss Evangeline Dubois' spectral demise was heavier than any physical weight. The oppressive presence that had saturated St. Augustine's for centuries, the accumulated weight of countless sins and sorrows, had not vanished, but it had shifted, receded, as if a great malevolent lung had finally, shudderingly exhaled. The shadows were just shadows now, devoid of their earlier sentience, their predatory hunger. The hymnals lay closed and silent on their shelves. The pews stood mute, their wood no longer groaning with borrowed confessions. The ledger on the altar was just an ancient, decaying book, its pages filled with an ink that now looked merely old, not menacingly alive. Lena, Father Moreau, and I stood in the dusty, debris-strewn nave, breathing heavily, covered in a fine layer of something that felt like cold ash. The dissonant peal had not been without its cost. The bell tower now leaned at an even more precarious angle, and several of the stained glass windows, already fragile, had shattered completely, letting in the cold, damp air of the bayou and the first hesitant rays of a winter solstice dawn. Father Moreau sank onto a nearby step, his crucifix still clutched in his hand, his face a mixture of terror, exhaustion, and a dawning, incredulous hope. "She's gone," he whispered. "The Cantor of Sins, the undying custodian, truly gone, truly gone." "I think," Lena said, her voice hoarse, looking at the spot where Miss Dubois had been consumed by the shadows. I think the church finally collected its oldest debt. We found no physical trace of Miss Dubois. It was as if she had been written out of existence, her long, unnatural life extinguished, her essence reabsorbed into the very fabric of the place she had both served and imprisoned. The HM, where the ledger had come from, was now just a dusty, empty crypt. The thousands of tiny confession scrolls gone, turned to a fine gray powder. Over the next few days, an almost palpable lightness began to fill St. Augustine's. The oppressive atmosphere lifted. The cloying scent of lilies and decay faded, replaced by the cleaner, sharper smells of old stone, damp wood, and the Bayou's natural breath. My restoration work, which I continued with a new, almost reverent diligence, no longer felt like a penance, but a quiet act of healing. For the church, and perhaps for myself, the guilt of the Ashworth collection still lingered, a scar that would never fully fade, but it no longer had the power to cripple me. I had faced a far greater, more personal judgment, and somehow survived. Father Moreau, with newfound vigor, began the slow, arduous process of reconsecrating the church, not in the name of the shadowy Heritage Society, but in the truest sense, hoping to embellican it to a place of genuine sanctuary, however humble. Lena, her artistic energies fired by the incredible events, began a new series of sketches, not of the church's Gothic gloom, but of its emerging light, its fragile resilience. The authorities, when they were finally, and very vaguely, notified by Father Moreau of a change in management at the remote St. Augustine site, showed little interest beyond ensuring the structural integrity of the decaying bell tower. Miss Emmeline Dubois, it seemed, had been as much a ghost in the official records as she had been in life. The St. Augustine Heritage Preservation Society evaporated like morning mist. My last act before leaving St. Augustine's, my temporary stewardship complete, was to climb the treacherous stairs of the bell tower. The great bronze bell hung silent, coated in a fine layer of the same gray ash that had covered us. I reached out and gently touched its cold, pitted surface. It did not ring. It did not summon. It simply was. A silent sentinel, its long, dark watch finally over. As I walked away from the church for the last time, the bayou around me seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The silence was no longer watchful, no longer hungry. It was just silence, the kind that allowed for peace. Years passed. I never returned to the rarefied world of high-profile archival work. The Ashworth collection disaster, though no longer a source of crippling guilt, remained a humbling reminder of past fallibility. Instead, I found a quiet niche, working with small, often overlooked historical societies, helping to preserve the fragile everyday histories of ordinary people. It was honest work, grounding work. The memory of St. Augustine's, however, never truly faded. It became a part of me, a shadowy undercurrent beneath the surface of my new life. I carried its lessons, that some silences are more eloquent than any sermon, that true absolution comes not from external judgment, but from internal reckoning, and that even the most ancient, deeply ingrained darkness can sometimes be dispelled by a single, dissonant act of courage. Father Moreau, I heard, Riussi in his efforts. St. Augustine's, though still remote, still bearing the scars of its long, dark history, became a small, thriving community church once more. A place of quiet contemplation and genuine, unburdened faith. He never spoke publicly of Miss Dubois or the true nature of the old ways, but his sermons, Lena told me in her occasional letters, often touched upon themes of hidden burdens, the echoes of past sins, and the enduring power of grace in the face of past profound darkness. Lina Baptista's art flourished. Her Bayou Requiem series, inspired by her experiences at St. Augustine's, haunting, abstract depictions of light battling shadow, of ancient stones breathing with newfound life, garnered critical acclaim. She never explicitly detailed the source of her inspiration, but those who looked closely could discern the faint outlines of a forgotten church, a crumbling bell tower, and the spectral outline of a woman who was both ancient and ageless. One crisp autumn afternoon, years after I'd left Louisiana, I was working in the archives of a small historical society in rural New England. I came across a dusty, uncatalogued crate of papers, salvaged from a recently demolished 18th century meeting house. As I carefully sifted through the fragile documents, my fingers brushed against a small, leather-bound hymnal, its cover warped and stained. My heart gave a familiar, unwelcome lurch. With a sense of trepidation I hadn't felt in years, I opened it. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded. But there, on the inside cover, in a spidery, archaic script, was a single name, Evangeline D., and beneath it, a date, 1788. A wave of dizziness washed over me. The familiar, cloying scent of lilies and decaying paper seemed to fill the small, sunlit archive room. I looked closer. Tucked between the pages, almost invisible, was a tiny pressed sprig of what looked like Spanish moss. Miss Evangeline Dubois, the Cantor of Sins, the undying custodian of St. Augustine's, had not been unique. She, or things like her, were part of an older, wider network, a hidden congregation of keepers and collectors, bound to forgotten places, ancient rituals, and the enduring, insatiable hunger of unrepented sin. Her acquittance at St. Augustine's had perhaps only been a temporary release, a transference of a burden that would inevitably find a new vessel, a new sanctum. I closed the hymnal, a profound weariness settling over me. The bell, it seemed, might never truly fall silent. The shadows might always be listening, and the pews in countless forgotten churches across the land might still be creaking with the unspoken sermons of the damned. My own small act of defiance, my dissonant peal in a Louisiana swamp, had perhaps only bought a moment's peace in a very long, very old war. And the greatest, most terrifying sin of all, I realized, was the belief that it could ever truly be won. Won. The weight of unburdened sin, it clings to you, doesn't it? Elias Thorne learned that some churches don't offer forgiveness. They offer an eternity of regret. Miss Evangeline Dubois is gone, but the lexicon of judgment remains. Seriously, if you didn't watch until the very end, you missed the most chilling part. The twist that reveals the true, terrifying scope of this story. The final moments change everything. What do you think became of Miss Dubois? What is the true nature of the lexicon? Share your theories in the comments below. And if you made it through the night at St. Augustine's, if the pews haven't claimed your confessions, then you are part of our congregation now. Subscribe to Night Creepypasta Rules, because some sins are never truly forgiven. And the bell, it might ring again.